Jonathan Steele was a 45-year-old mogul, a man who seemed to have it all: wealth, power, and influence. Yet, in the vast emptiness of his sprawling mansion, he was reminded of the one thing he lacked: a legacy. After 2 failed marriages and a lifetime of avoiding emotional entanglements, Jonathan had convinced himself that love was a delusion, a distraction that only led to pain. But a child? That was different. A child would carry his name, his empire, and everything he had built. However, Jonathan didn't want the messiness of a family or the vulnerability of love. What he needed was a controlled transaction, a surrogacy without complications. He had the resources to make it happen. And for him, this was just another deal to close. One morning, as Jonathan navigated the streets of the city in his sleek sports car, his attention was drawn to a woman sitting on the sidewalk. She was scribbling furiously on a piece of crumpled paper, her dark curls tumbling over her face. Despite her disheveled appearance, her green eyes burned with an intensity that made her hard to ignore. She seemed oblivious to the world around her, her focus entirely on her makeshift art. The light turned green, and Jonathan forced himself to drive on. But something about her lingered in his mind. A few blocks later, he abruptly turned into a parking lot and sat there, his hands gripping the steering wheel. Against his better judgment, he found himself driving back. Pulling up to the curb, he rolled down his window and called out, "You. Come here." The woman looked up, her expression guarded. She hesitated, clearly weighing her options. Finally, she stood and approached the car, her movements slow and deliberate. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice firm despite her apparent vulnerability. "Get in," Jonathan ordered. "We need to talk." The woman, who introduced herself as Maya Brooks, reluctantly agreed to accompany him to a quiet cafe. Over steaming cups of coffee, Jonathan laid out his proposition. He wanted her to have his child. Maya blinked, her fingers tightening around the mug. "You're serious?" "Completely," Jonathan replied, his tone as cold and precise as ever. "I'll cover all your expenses, provide you with every comfort, and at the end, you'll receive a sum of money that will change your life." Maya leaned back, her skepticism evident. "And what happens after the baby is born?" "You'll walk away, free and unburdened. I'll take full custody. No strings attached." Maya laughed bitterly. "No strings? You're asking me to give up a part of myself. How do I know you won't screw me over?" Jonathan smirked. "You'll have a contract. Ironclad. It'll protect both of us." The weight of the decision settled heavily on Maya. She was homeless, hungry, and desperate. But the idea of selling her body, and a piece of her soul, felt almost unbearable. "You have 48 hours to decide," Jonathan said, rising from the table. "After that, the offer is off the table." 2 days later, Maya found herself standing at the gates of Jonathan's mansion. Her decision hadn't been easy, but the promise of a fresh start was too tempting to ignore. "I accept," she told him, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her heart. Jonathan nodded, producing the contract. "Then let's make this official." The terms were clear. Maya would be cared for throughout the pregnancy, but she would relinquish all rights to the child once it was born. With a deep breath, Maya signed her name, sealing the agreement that would change both their lives. Life in the mansion was luxurious, but isolating. Maya was given every comfort: designer clothes, gourmet meals, and access to the finest medical care. Yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was more of an asset than a person. Jonathan, true to his nature, kept his distance, treating her as a means to an end. One evening, as she wandered the vast gardens, she stumbled upon Jonathan sitting by a fountain. For the first time, she saw him not as a ruthless businessman but as a man weighed down by his own demons. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked, breaking the silence. "Regret what?" he replied, his voice guarded. "Living your life like it's a business plan." Jonathan's jaw tightened. Planning is what keeps everything in order. Without it, there's chaos. Maya smiled faintly. Sometimes chaos is what makes life worth living. Months passed, and the pregnancy progressed smoothly. One day, Jonathan accompanied Maya to a routine appointment. As they listened to the rhythmic thump of the baby's heartbeat, something shifted in the room. Maya's eyes welled with tears, while Jonathan sat frozen, the sound piercing through his carefully constructed walls. Later that evening, Jonathan found Maya in the library, staring at the fire. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice softer than usual. "I don't know," she admitted. Hearing that heartbeat, it made everything feel real. Jonathan nodded, his gaze distant. "It's strange, isn't it? How something so small can have such an impact." For the first time, Maya saw a flicker of vulnerability in him, and it made her wonder if there was more to Jonathan's steel than his cold exterior. As the months went on, the dynamic between Maya and Jonathan began to change. Their conversations grew longer, their silences more comfortable. Maya started to see glimpses of humanity in him, a dry sense of humor, a deep intellect, and even moments of kindness. But just as their bond deepened, the reality of their agreement loomed larger. Maya knew that when the baby was born, she would have to walk away. And Jonathan, despite his growing attachment, reminded himself that this was merely a transaction. Or was it? Jonathan's office was his sanctuary, a place where he controlled every variable. Yet, since Maya had entered his life, his focus faltered. The files before him blurred as his mind wandered to the sound of her laughter in the garden, or the way she cradled her growing belly protectively. He shook his head. This wasn't supposed to happen. That evening, as he stood by the large window overlooking the city lights, Maya approached cautiously. "You okay?" she asked, her voice carrying genuine concern. Jonathan turned, surprised. "Shouldn't I be asking you that?" Maya shrugged, her eyes studying him. "You seem distracted." "I'm not," he replied too quickly, his tone sharper than intended. Maya raised an eyebrow. "You're a terrible liar, you know." A flicker of a smile crossed his lips. "I'm just thinking." "About what?" For a moment, he hesitated. Then, almost imperceptibly, he said, "About what happens after this." Maya's heart skipped a beat. She wanted to press him, to ask what he meant, but the vulnerability in his eyes held her back. One afternoon, Jonathan surprised Maya with a trip into the city. "I thought you might need a change of scenery," he said, guiding her to his car. Maya, unaccustomed to such gestures from him, hesitated. "You taking a day off? Are you feeling okay?" He smirked. "Don't get used to it." They visited a small art gallery tucked away in a quiet corner of the city. Maya's eyes lit up as she admired the paintings, her fingers tracing the edges of the canvases. Jonathan observed her from a distance, captivated by the way she seemed to come alive in the presence of art. "What do you see in these?" he asked, genuinely curious. "Emotion," she replied. "Every brushstroke tells a story. It's messy, but it's real." Jonathan frowned. "Messy doesn't sound appealing." Maya laughed softly. "That's your problem, Jonathan. You're so afraid of chaos that you miss the beauty in it." Her words lingered long after they returned to the mansion. Late one night, while Maya was asleep, Jonathan found himself drawn to her room. He hesitated at the door before quietly stepping inside. On the nightstand was a stack of papers. At the top lay an unfinished letter addressed to the baby. He read the first few lines. "To the little one growing inside me, I don't know what kind of life awaits you, but I want you to know you were loved before you even opened your eyes." The letter trailed off, but it struck Jonathan like a blow. He hadn't considered how deeply Maya was already connected to the child. Slipping out of the room, he retreated to his own, feeling the weight of emotions he couldn't name. As Maya's due date approached, Jonathan became more involved. He accompanied her to every appointment, insisted on overseeing the nursery preparations, and even began reading books on fatherhood. One night, While they shared a quiet dinner, Maya asked, "Why are you doing all this?" Jonathan set his glass down, his gaze steady. "Because it matters. You and the baby, you matter." Maya's breath caught. She searched his face for any sign of insincerity, but found none. "You never wanted to get attached," she said softly. "Maybe I was wrong," he admitted. The night the baby decided to arrive was chaotic, as if the universe had conspired to throw Jonathan into the one thing he feared most. A sudden storm knocked out the power at the mansion, and the roads to the hospital were flooded. Jonathan didn't panic, though his hands trembled as he helped Maya into the car. "We'll make it," he promised, his voice firm despite the storm raging around them. Maya, in pain but comforted by his presence, gripped his hand tightly. "Don't let go," she whispered. "I won't," he assured her, and for the first time, he meant it with every fiber of his being. When the baby's cries filled the room, Jonathan felt a surge of emotion unlike anything he'd ever experienced. He held the tiny bundle in his arms, his heart swelling with a love that was both terrifying and exhilarating. Maya watched him, tears streaming down her face. "You're a natural," she said, her voice choked with emotion. Jonathan looked at her, his walls completely shattered. "Thank you," he said, his voice breaking. "For everything." As Maya recovered, the reality of their agreement loomed over them. Jonathan was supposed to take custody, and Maya was supposed to walk away. But neither could imagine a life without the other now. One evening, as they sat by the fireplace with the baby sleeping soundly between them, Jonathan broke the silence. "Stay," he said simply. Maya looked at him, her heart pounding. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I don't want you to leave," he admitted. "I want you to be part of this, part of us." Tears filled Maya's eyes as she realized that, for the first time in her life, she had found not just a home, but a family. The journey ahead wasn't without its challenges, but for Jonathan and Maya, it was worth every struggle. Together they built a life filled with love, laughter, and the kind of chaos that made everything worthwhile. Jonathan Steele, the man who once believed love was a distraction, finally understood that it was the one thing that made life truly meaningful. And Maya, the woman who had once been lost, found her way home.